11 years into my marriage, my husband stood in front of more than 200 guests and announced that I had put my mother's house up as collateral for a $5 million business loan. Everyone applauded. I didn't. Adrian stood in the middle of the hotel ballroom wearing the charcoal suit I had helped him choose a month earlier. He held a glass of champagne in one hand and looked like a man who believed his life was finally becoming everything he had ever wanted. Then he smiled at the crowd, and I especially want to thank my wife, Mara. Every face in the room turned toward me. For Harborline, she was willing to put up the property that means more to her than anything else. That kind of trust is the reason Cole House is able to keep growing. The applause got louder. My mother-in-law, Vivian, actually stood and dabbed at the corner of one eye with a napkin. The woman sitting beside me leaned over and whispered, "Mara, that is incredibly generous." I smiled. Then I picked up the microphone from our table. "Adrian?" He turned toward me. "Yeah, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly." His smile stayed in place. "Of course. You said I already signed the guarantee?" "Yes. When?" "Last week." I nodded slowly. "That might be a problem." The room started to quiet down, because I never signed it. Adrian's smile finally disappeared. I kept going, and as of this morning, the bank has frozen the loan. A glass touched a plate somewhere behind me. Nobody else moved. The signature on the collateral agreement is being investigated. I looked toward a banking attorney seated several tables away, and the notary listed as the witness has already admitted that she never met me. This time there was no applause. Adrian stared at me. I could almost see him trying to decide whether I was bluffing or whether I really knew. I knew, and I knew more than he could imagine. I knew the $5 million loan was not simply meant to save the company. I knew at least $1.2 million of it had been budgeted for a marketing company connected to his mistress. I knew they had a luxury apartment in Boston's Seaport District. I knew he had already spoken to a divorce attorney. And I knew that after Harborline opened, he planned to tell me that our marriage had been over for a long time. What Adrian did not know was that before I gave up my career for his family, I spent 12 years investigating corporate fraud. I was not confused by what he was doing. I had spent 6 weeks making sure I understood exactly what kind of man I had married. That night, Adrian thought he was announcing the biggest project of his career. Instead, in front of more than 200 people, he announced the fraud that was about to cost him nearly everything, and it all started 6 weeks earlier. My name is Mara Ellison. I'm 37 years old. Most people had called me Mara Cole for the last 11 years. Before I became somebody's wife, I worked in forensic accounting at a risk consulting firm in Boston. In simple terms, when a company knew money was disappearing but didn't know how, people like me came in and found it. Fake invoices, kickbacks, hidden accounts, falsified reimbursements, payments to companies that existed on paper but nowhere else. I loved the work. Numbers don't panic, they don't get defensive, they don't look you in the eye and tell you that you're imagining things. A person can say, "I didn't do it," a bank statement can't. I first met Adrian because his father's hotel company had a problem. Cole House was still small back then, 6 boutique hotels. One of their renovation projects had gone almost $2 million over budget. Adrian's father, Henry, suspected the contractor and someone inside purchasing were working together. Adrian was running operations. I was assigned to the investigation. We argued in our first meeting. I placed a stack of invoices in front of him. "Why did the same furniture supplier charge you 30% above market price for 7 months?" Adrian barely looked down. "They were custom pieces. The invoices list standard models. Then accounting probably coded them incorrectly. For 7 months?" He leaned back in his chair. "Are you this rude to every client? Only the ones missing $2 million? He stared at me. Then he laughed. I didn't. 3 weeks later, we found the problem. Adrian had not been involved. The purchasing director had been taking kickbacks from the supplier. Cole House recovered part of the money. Henry took our entire team out to dinner. Adrian sat beside me. Halfway through the meal, he asked, "Are you always like this?" "Like what?" "Someone tells you something and you assume it might be a lie?" "I don't assume it's a lie. You definitely do. I trust evidence. That sounds exhausting. It's cheaper than trusting the wrong person." At the time, I had no idea how often I would remember that sentence. Adrian did not court me like a movie character. There were no private planes, no room full of roses, No huge public gestures. He remembered that I usually worked late on Wednesdays and kept my favorite yogurt in his refrigerator. When I came home from a business trip exhausted, he didn't insist that we go out because he missed me. He dimmed the lights, ordered food, and let me sleep. When my mother had surgery, he stayed at the hospital with me for 17 hours. At 2 in the morning, I sat beside a vending machine and cried because I was scared. He sat beside me. He did not tell me everything would be fine. He did not try to fix something he couldn't fix. He just held my hand. I loved him. I want to be clear about that. What happened later does not require me to pretend the beginning was fake. A year and a half after we started dating, Adrian proposed. A few months before our wedding, my mother transferred the Back Bay townhouse where I had grown up into my name. It was a 4-story brick house. The windows were old. The heating bill in January was ridiculous. The staircase creaked in 3 different places. But it was home. My mother had moved to Florida, and when she gave me the property, she said, "Never get so married that you think you're not allowed to have something that belongs only to you." At the time, I thought she was being overly cautious. Years later, I understood she had simply lived longer than I had. The first 3 years of my marriage to Adrian were good. His father's health started failing. Cole House was expanding too fast. I often reviewed budgets after work. Some weekends, I went through hundreds of pages of vendor contracts for free. Henry tried more than once to pay me consulting fees. I refused. I thought we were family. Then, during our 4th year of marriage, Henry had a stroke. Everything changed. There was suddenly no one really controlling the company's finances. Adrian started working 16-hour days. He would come home, sit on the edge of the bed, and fall asleep without taking off his shoes. At the same time, I had just been promoted to senior manager. My firm was talking to me about a partner track position. I had worked more than a decade for that opportunity. Then one night, Adrian sat at our kitchen table and said, "I can't do this." His eyes were red. He looked exhausted. "The company needs me. My dad needs me. My mom is falling apart. I don't know how to handle all of it." I asked, "What do you need from me?" He was quiet for a long time. "Come help me for 1 year." "Just one?" "1 year. Help me stabilize the company. Then you go back." I resigned from my firm. Looking back, Adrian did not force me to do that. I made the choice. I loved him. I loved Henry. I believed I was helping my family. So I will never rewrite that decision and pretend I had no part in it. The problem was that 1 year became 7. At first, I really did help Cole House. I reorganized vendor contracts. I created approval controls. I shut down projects that were quietly losing money. I negotiated with banks. I reviewed debt terms. I built systems that made it harder for one person to approve, pay, and hide the same transaction. When Henry recovered enough to return to work part-time, he offered me a formal executive role. Adrian told him it wasn't necessary. "We're family," he said. "Mara doesn't need a title." At the time, I thought it sounded loving. I thought he meant we didn't need to calculate what belonged to whom. Now I know the person who stops calculating is often the person who ends up giving the most away. As the company became more stable, I stepped back. Adrian became CEO. Vivian handled charity events and social relationships, and I slowly became Adrian's wife. At first, he told people, Cole House would not be where it is without Mara. Then it became, Mara used to be great with numbers. Later it became, she doesn't really follow this stuff anymore. Eventually, he started saying, Mara doesn't understand the way business works today. The first time I heard him say that in public was at a dinner with investors. Someone asked me what I thought about Cole House buying a small coastal resort. I started to answer, I think the debt ratio might be a little. Adrian laughed and cut me off. Mara's been out of the industry for years. A few people around the table laughed politely. Not at me exactly, just the kind of social laugh people give when the person in charge makes a joke. I laughed too. When we got home, I told him the comment bothered me. He was looking at his phone. What comment? You told everyone I don't understand the industry anymore? I was keeping the conversation light. It wasn't true. He finally looked up. Mara, why do you need to prove that you still know everything? I'm not trying to prove anything. Then stop taking everything personally. That was the first time I clearly felt something had shifted between us, but the person who really made me pay attention was Tessa Reed. She was 9 years younger than I was. Cole House hired her as the new head of brand strategy. She was smart, beautiful, quick, the kind of person who could walk into a room, remember everyone's name, and make each of them feel like they were the one person she had been hoping to meet. The first time I met her was at a charity event. She came straight toward me and hugged me. "Mara, I'm so happy to finally meet you." "Finally?" "Adrian talks about you all the time. He says he never would have gotten this far without you." I smiled. "At least he remembers." She laughed. "At the time, I didn't think much of it." Then Tessa started appearing everywhere. Saturday night, Adrian had to go deal with a media issue. Tessa was there. Sunday morning, an investor supposedly flew into town unexpectedly. Tessa was there. We had planned a weekend in Maine before our anniversary. On the morning we were supposed to leave, Adrian told me Tessa had landed an important partnership opportunity, and he had to stay in Boston. I went alone. At 11 that night, I saw a short video posted to one of the hotel's social media accounts. Adrian and Tessa were in the background. The clip was only 4 seconds long. She was standing very close to him. While she spoke, her hand rested naturally against his chest. I watched those 4 seconds about 20 times, then I turned off my phone. I did not confront him. 11 years of marriage had taught me something my old career had taught me even earlier. When you ask a person a question before he is ready to tell the truth, you usually don't get the truth. You just get a better lie. The real moment everything changed happened 6 weeks before our anniversary. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I received an authenticated message from our bank. The subject line said, "Additional confirmation required for Ellison House collateral." I read it 3 times. Ellison House was the Back Bay property my mother had given me. I had never applied for a mortgage against it. At first I assumed the message was a scam, so I called the bank using the number from my own records. The message was real. A loan officer told me, "Cole House Hospitality is applying for a $5 million commercial loan. Your property is listed as additional collateral." I gripped the phone tighter. "Who authorized that?" There was a pause. "We have a signed authorization from you." My hands went cold. "Send me a copy." 15 minutes later, I opened the documents. Page 1 had my full name. Page 2 listed the townhouse. Page 3 contained the collateral authorization. The final page carried a signature. Mara Ellison Cole. It looked like mine, but I had not written it. I stared at it, and for one strange second I almost laughed. Adrian had lived with me for 11 years. He knew what my signature looked like. What he did not know was that I had spent years studying forged signatures in fraud cases. Fake signatures are often too careful. Real signatures have habits. Mine had one. The final stroke of the M never curled back. On that document it did. I did not call Adrian. I opened every attachment the bank had sent. The loan was listed as funding for Cole House Harborline Resort Development. I knew about Harborline. It was supposed to be the company's next major project. What I did not know was that Adrian was trying to use my house to secure it. Then I noticed something else. The project budget included a $1.2 million fee for brand consulting. The vendor was Reed North Creative. I had never heard of the company, but the name Reed stopped me. Tessa Reed. It took me less than 20 minutes to find the public records. Reed North Creative had been created 9 months earlier. Its registered address was a corporate agent's office in Delaware. No real employees, no public website. The controlling member was Tessa's brother. I sat at my desk without moving. This was no longer a strange loan document. Adrian was not simply trying to put my house behind a company project. He was also planning to send a huge piece of the loan into a company tied to Tessa. That night, he came home in an unusually good mood. He brought wine. He kissed my forehead. 6 weeks from now at our anniversary dinner, I've got a big surprise. I looked at him. What kind of surprise? If I tell you, it isn't a surprise. Is it about Harborline? He paused for less than a second. Why are you asking about that? You've been busy. It's just financing. He opened the bottle. Boring stuff. Boring stuff. The first time Adrian ever came into my office, money had been disappearing from his company. Back then, he thought what I did was impressive. Now, the same kind of information had become boring stuff that I apparently didn't need to understand. I smiled. Okay, I won't ask. That night, after Adrian fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room until 4 in the morning. I did not cry. What hurt most was not the forged signature. It was the question that kept repeating in my head. When had I stopped being his partner? When had I become someone he thought did not deserve an explanation? The next morning, I called Nina Brooks. Nina and I had worked together years earlier. She now ran a small forensic accounting firm. We had not seen each other in 3 years. The moment she answered, she said, "Mara Ellison, you still remember me?" Unfortunately, what happened? I need your help, business or marriage, both. 48 hours later, we were sitting in her office. She read the loan documents slowly. This signature is not yours? No. The notary? I've never met her. Does Adrian know you found this? No, Nina placed the documents on the desk. Then don't tell him yet. It was advice I had given clients hundreds of times. Do not alert the person who may be hiding evidence. Protect the evidence first. Hearing the words directed at me felt strange. It also felt familiar. Like some part of my old self had been sitting in a dark room for years and had just turned the light back on. We contacted the bank first. The lender paused the application and began its own review. My attorney filed a fraud alert against any attempt to encumber the Back Bay property. Then Nina started reviewing every piece of Cole House financial information we could legally access. 3 days later, she called me. Mara. What? You need to come in. When I reached her office, she turned a spreadsheet toward me. Cole House had not merely budgeted money for Reed North Creative. Over the previous 18 months, the company had already paid the firm $780,000. The invoices described services like brand research, customer positioning, international market consulting, and media crisis management. Some months had 3 separate invoices on the exact same day. I asked, did they actually do any of this work?
I can't prove they didn't yet.
Yet? Nina clicked into another file. There's more. Cole House had leased a luxury apartment in the Seaport district. The books called it executive temporary housing. The authorized occupant was Tessa Reed. I said nothing. Nina watched me. Do you want me to keep going? I looked at the screen. Yes, the picture got uglier. Hotel bills, flights, jewelry, restaurants, private cars. Many of the expenses had been paid or reimbursed through Cole House. Adrian had managed to make at least part of his relationship with Tessa look like ordinary corporate spending. I still did not have direct proof that they were sleeping together. Then, during the 4th week, Vivian asked me to lunch. She chose the private club she loved. She wore a cream-colored suit and held my hand as soon as I sat down. Mara, are you and Adrian having problems? I looked at her. Did he tell you that? Men under pressure can be difficult. Harborline is very important to him. A server placed coffee on the table. Vivian lowered her voice. You should support him. I've supported him for 11 years. I know. She smiled. So support him one more time. How? She looked directly at me. Your house. My hand stopped beside the coffee cup. Adrian told you? She hesitated. Just once, of course. He thinks you already agreed. I didn't. Her smile faded. Mara. Yes? You live in that enormous house with one other person. What do you need it for? My mother gave it to me. I know. But marriage is about sharing, I asked her. If it were your house, would you sign? Vivian did not answer. She adjusted her napkin. Cole House is your future too, is it? Of course. Then why have I not been invited to a board meeting in 3 years? Her expression hardened. You're not really involved in that side anymore. That was when I understood. This was not only how Adrian saw me. The entire family had grown comfortable with the same arrangement. Mara understands. Mara sacrifices. Mara supports. Mara does not need to know. Before lunch ended, Vivian held my hand again. Don't ruin your marriage over something small. I looked at her. Forging my signature is small? Her hand immediately released mine. For several seconds, we just stared at each other. She did not ask what I meant. She only said, you should talk to Adrian first. That was my answer. She knew. I cried for the first time on the drive home. Not really because of Adrian, because I remembered Henry telling me years earlier, this family is lucky to have you. I had believed I was part of the family. Apparently, when they needed my skill, I was family. When they needed my signature, I was a wife. When they needed me to stay quiet, I was simply a woman who did not understand business anymore. That night, I made a decision. I started the process of restoring my professional practice status. I had kept up with continuing education over the years. I had never completely left the field. I had simply stopped claiming a formal place in it. 2 weeks later, my name appeared in the professional database again. Mara Ellison, forensic accounting consultant. I stared at those words for a long time. That was me. Not Mrs. Cole, not the CEO's wife, not the agreeable daughter-in-law. Me. Around the same time, someone inside Cole House reached out. Her name was Rachel Monroe. She was a financial controller. We had worked together when I was still helping the company directly. Her email was one sentence. "Do you still know how to read a ledger?" I replied, "Better than ever." We met at a coffee shop far from Coal House headquarters. Rachel sat down and skipped the small talk. She placed a flash drive on the table. "If I give you this, I may lose my job." "Then why are you giving it to me?" She looked out the window. "Because Adrian started moving employee money." My stomach dropped. Coal House kept reserve funds for maintenance, payroll-related obligations, and employee programs across its hotels. As cash got tighter, Adrian had started moving portions of those reserves into Harborline without full board approval. That was already dangerous. But the bigger problem was that loan applications still listed those reserves as available cash. The same money was effectively being presented twice. Rachel said. I objected. "What did he say?" "He said I was there to record numbers, not understand company strategy." I almost laughed. Adrian had one strategy for women who asked questions: convince them they did not understand enough to ask. Rachel pulled out another approval record. Vivian's signature was on it. She had known about several large payments to Reed North Creative. What began as a problem with my husband was turning into a governance problem across the company. That put me in a position I had not expected. If I dumped everything into the public all at once, Coal House could collapse. The company had more than 900 employees: housekeepers, front desk staff, maintenance workers, kitchen staff, drivers, managers, people with mortgages and children and medical bills. They had not forged my signature. They had not leased an apartment for Tessa. I was not willing to throw 900 people off a cliff just to make Adrian fall faster. So I did not release everything. I called Henry. Adrian's father had barely been involved since his stroke. We met at his rehabilitation residence. He looked much older than I remembered. His right hand still did not move perfectly. I placed the collateral agreement in front of him. He read it, then he read it again. His hand began to shake. "Are you sure Adrian knew about this? His electronic approval is attached? And Vivian?" I said nothing. Henry closed his eyes. For the first time, I understood that a father can be afraid to learn exactly who his son has become. After a long silence, he asked, "Mara, I still have 14% of the voting shares." I waited. "Do you remember what you have?" I stared at him. "What I have, the 8%. I had almost forgotten. Years earlier, when I left my firm to help Coal House, Henry had insisted on compensating me for part of the work. Instead of cash, I had received an 8% ownership stake. At the time, it represented roughly 2 years of consulting fees. The shares had remained in my investment account. Adrian never asked about them. Why would he? He had already decided I would never involve myself in the company again, Henry said. "If Rachel is willing to speak to outside counsel and I can get the support of the independent directors, we can suspend Adrian's management authority before he damages the company further." I looked at him. "You're willing to do that to your son?" His voice was quiet. "The company cannot become anyone's personal wallet, even his, especially his." We planned to call an emergency board meeting the morning after our anniversary event, but Adrian gave me a better opening. 2 days before the anniversary, he suddenly became very affectionate. He brought flowers home. He cooked dinner. He even pulled out our old wedding album. 11 years, he said. "We've been through a lot." I turned the pages. There was a photograph of us eating pizza on the kitchen floor right after we got married. The house was still under renovation. We were surrounded by boxes. The way Adrian looked at me in that picture was real. I know it was. That was what made everything harder. Not every betrayal means every moment before it was a performance. Sometimes the worst part is that the good part was real, and the person still chose to hurt you later. Adrian sat beside me. "After the anniversary party, let's take a trip." "Where? Italy? Just us? Just us?" I looked at him. "What about Tessa?" His smile disappeared. "There it is again." "I'm asking a question." "Mara, she works for me. You've been working together a lot? You are getting way too sensitive." In the past, that sentence would have made me question myself. That night, I simply nodded. "Maybe." He visibly relaxed. Then he pulled out a folder. "One more thing." "What?" "The bank needs an updated asset form." He put the folder in front of me. "Can you sign it? Now?" "It'll take 30 seconds. How many pages?" "You don't have to read it. It's the same stuff as before." "The same stuff as before?" Those words ended the last bit of hesitation I had. I picked up the folder. Tomorrow. I have a headache, he frowned. Then his face softened again. Okay. When he went upstairs to shower, I texted Nina. He tried again. She responded almost immediately. Then we're done waiting. On the night of our anniversary party, Adrian had no idea the bank had already frozen the loan. His lending contact had been instructed not to alert him while the documents were being reviewed. He did not know Rachel had turned key internal records over to outside counsel. He definitely did not know Henry was coming. Adrian believed his father was too weak to attend. At 8:12 that evening, Adrian stepped onto the small stage in the ballroom. He gave a speech about family, responsibility, growth, the future of Cole House. Then he mentioned me. The person I owe the most to is Mara. A spotlight moved toward my table. She has sacrificed more for this family than anyone knows. I almost laughed. He had finally told the truth. He just did not understand that sacrifice has a limit, he continued. For Harborline, she was even willing to put up the property her mother left her so we could secure the next stage of financing. The ballroom erupted in applause. I saw Vivian smiling. Across the room, Tessa was smiling too. So I stood, I picked up a microphone, and I told everyone I had never signed the document. The room changed instantly. Adrian's face went still. Mara, his voice dropped. This isn't funny, I'm not joking. You must have forgotten that I pledged a $5 million property? Someone laughed nervously, then stopped. I continued. The bank froze the loan this morning. The signature is under review, and the notary listed on the agreement has stated that she never met me. Tessa slowly began moving toward the ballroom doors. I turned my head. Tessa, she stopped. Since the Harborline project includes significant payments to your consulting vendor, I think you should stay. Adrian immediately stepped in. This has nothing to do with her. Really? The large presentation screen behind him came on. There were no private text messages, no intimate photos, no hotel room pictures. I had no interest in turning my marriage into entertainment. There were only business records. Read North Creative. $780,000 already paid. An additional $1.2 million budgeted. The corporate relationship to Tessa's brother. The Seaport apartment. The unusual reimbursements. Then the forged collateral authorization. I saved the most important record for last, the internal transfers from employee and operating reserves into Harborline. Several executives in the room visibly changed expression. Adrian stared at the screen. You had no right to release internal company records. I did not release the full books. I looked directly at him. And I do have a right to ask questions. Henry slowly stood from the third row. The room became quiet again. He leaned on a cane. Because Mara is still a shareholder in Cole House. Adrian turned so fast I thought he might lose his balance. Dad? Henry did not look at him. When this event ends, the board will meet immediately. Until an independent investigation is completed, your management authority is suspended. That was what finally hit Adrian. Until that second, part of him still believed this was a marriage fight. He probably believed he could take me home, close the door, and tell me I misunderstood. That I was emotional, that I did not understand the business, that someone else had manipulated me. But now he had to face something he could not solve with the language he had used on me for years. Evidence. Tessa suddenly walked out of the ballroom. Adrian took 2 steps after her, then stopped because everyone was watching. He turned back toward me. Mara, do you have any idea what you're doing? Yes, you could destroy this company. I did not move employee reserves into a high-risk development. I did not submit false collateral. And I did not put expenses connected to my affair into company accounts. His face changed immediately. Affair? I held his eyes. Do you want me to keep going? He said nothing. That was enough. We did not go home together that night. I stayed in Nina's guest room at 1:17 in the morning. Tessa sent me a message. We need to talk. I did not answer. 2 minutes later, another message appeared. He lied to me too. The next afternoon, I met her at my attorney's office. Tessa was not wearing makeup. She looked younger than usual and tired. Her first sentence was, I didn't forge your signature. I didn't say you did. You think I did. I think you know more than you've admitted. She lowered her eyes. After a while, she placed her phone on the table. There were months of messages from Adrian. Not 1 or 2 months. One message said, after Harborline opens, I'll deal with Mara. Tessa had replied, how much can she take in a divorce? Adrian answered, not much. She hasn't worked in 7 years. She doesn't have her own income. Even after everything I already knew, that sentence hurt. Some things still hurt even when you see them coming. Tessa scrolled again. Another message. Once the Back Bay house is handled, I'm free. And another. Mara won't really leave me. She barely looks at the accounts anymore. I stared at that one for a long time, because he was half right. For the last few years, I had not monitored our household finances closely. Not because I did not understand them, because I trusted him. He saw trust as a weakness in the system. Tessa started crying. She said Adrian had promised he would marry her. He told her Harborline would be the beginning of their new life, but when the loan was frozen, she asked whether her company would still receive the remaining consulting money. Adrian told her, "This is not the time to worry about your money." That was when she finally understood something. She and I were not as different as she liked to believe. We were both resources in Adrian's plan. He used love to keep me in place. He used promises about the future to keep her waiting. I asked her, "Why are you helping me?" "I'm not helping you." She wiped her face. "I'm protecting myself." I nodded. At least that's honest. She turned over the emails and expense records she controlled. I did not promise to make her consequences disappear. She had participated in questionable invoices. Whatever responsibility belonged to her still belonged to her. 3 days later, the emergency board meeting took place. Adrian was not thrown out of the company in one dramatic afternoon. Real companies do not work that way. 900 people depended on Cole House. The board brought in an outside team. High-risk payments were frozen. Harborline was suspended. Adrian and Vivian lost financial approval authority. Then the auditors found an even larger problem. Harborline was not the only project with bad numbers. Over the previous 3 years, Cole House had repeatedly counted event revenue before contracts were final. In a few cases, the same projected revenue appeared in more than one report. I asked Rachel, who approved this. She was quiet. Adrian, Vivian, she knew about some of it. Henry? I haven't found anything linking him to it. That mattered to me. I did not want to turn an entire family into villains because 2 people had done something wrong. Specific people make choices. Specific people should carry the consequences. The next 2 months were some of the hardest of my life. Attorneys, bank meetings, auditors, board meetings, divorce negotiations, calls from reporters. Some nights I was still awake at 3 in the morning. Once I went into the kitchen to make coffee and realized I was holding Adrian's favorite mug. I stood there and cried for 10 minutes. Then I washed it and put it back in the cabinet. I did not smash it. I did not throw it away. The mug had not hurt me. I did not need to destroy every object connected to my past to prove that I was leaving it behind. The first time Adrian truly begged me to reconsider was 1 week before divorce mediation. We met at the law firm. He had lost weight. There were dark circles under his eyes. He sat across from me and kept staring. "You're working again?" "Yes." "With Nina?" "Some work with her. I'm taking my own clients now." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "So you didn't forget any of it? I was out of practice. That means you could have left any time." I looked at him. "Adrian, what?" "I always could have left. I just didn't want to." He lowered his head. For a long time he said nothing. Then he whispered, "Tessa and I are done." "That's between you and Tessa. She gave you everything, didn't she? That's also between you and Tessa." His frustration suddenly surfaced. "Mara, do you really feel nothing anymore?" "Yes." He looked up immediately. "I feel 11 years. I remember leaving my career and sitting with your father through rehab. I remember us eating pizza on the floor when we first moved into the house. I remember staying all night at the hospital when your mother had surgery. I remember a lot of things that were real." His eyes filled with tears. "Then why can't we start over?" "Because a real past does not require me to accept who you became." He did not answer. "Your biggest mistake was not falling for someone else. That hurt me. Of course it did. But that is not the part I cannot come back from." I leaned forward. "You started believing I did not need to know where my own money was going. You believed I would not read a contract. You believed I could not support myself. Eventually you believed you had the right to sign my name. I let the silence sit between us. You did not only betray the marriage. You started treating me like a person who did not have the right to choose." Adrian rubbed his face. "I was under so much pressure. I was terrified Harborline would fail. I was terrified the company would collapse. I know. Then you understand. I understand the fear. I shook my head. Fear can explain why someone made a choice. It cannot take responsibility for that choice. He looked down again. Our divorce did not drag on for years. The Back Bay property was clearly my separate property. There was no real dispute over it. Our joint investment accounts were divided under the settlement. Adrian was required to repay part of the marital funds he had used without my knowledge. The corporate investigation continued separately. I did not ask the board to destroy Cole House. In fact, I supported a restructuring plan. 2 chronically unprofitable hotels were sold. Harborland was canceled. A new operating team came in. Most employees kept their jobs. Someone asked me, "Don't you want Adrian to lose everything?" "No," I answered immediately. "I want him to lose what was never his to take." There is a difference, revenge says. I'm hurting, so you have to hurt too. A boundary says, you do not get to keep benefiting from hurting me. I wanted the second one. Adrian eventually faced both criminal and civil consequences related to the loan documents and internal financial reporting. His final outcome was less severe than it could have been because he cooperated with the investigation and helped return part of the money. Vivian left the company. Months later, she sent me a long letter. One sentence stayed with me. I thought protecting my son meant removing every consequence from his life. Now I understand I was only teaching him that someone else would always carry the consequences for him. I never answered the letter. But I kept it. Sometimes an apology can matter even when it does not reopen a relationship. Cole House survived. Henry transferred his remaining voting influence to professional management. Rachel eventually became head of finance. A year later, the company was profitable again. I did not go back. That was no longer my life. I returned to the work I had once loved. My first year, I had 3 clients. My second year, I had 17. A surprising number of the women who came to me were not CEOs or wealthy investors. They were women who suddenly discovered debt in their names. Women whose spouses controlled every bank account. Women who had signed papers they were told were nothing important. Women who realized that you don't need to worry about the money. I'll handle it had slowly turned into, you have no idea what is happening in your own life. I began reserving part of my practice for those cases. Not for free. That mattered too. I had spent too many years believing love and loyalty meant my work should cost nothing, but when someone truly could not afford help, I partnered with legal aid organizations to make sure they had options. One day my mother asked me, "Do you regret marrying Adrian?" I thought about it for a long time. No. She looked surprised. Why not? Because I don't need to prove those 11 years were a mistake by pretending I never loved him. She nodded. Would you ever get married again? I laughed. I honestly don't know, and I didn't. At that point, I thought maybe this was enough. My work, my friends, my mother, my house. A quiet life that belonged to me. It was enough. Then I met Owen Pierce. Not at a law firm. Not because he worked on my case. Not because he was some billionaire who arrived to rescue me. That would have been too convenient. I met him because I decided to renovate the Back Bay house. After the divorce, I looked around one day and realized the entire place had slowly been redesigned around Adrian, dark wood, a huge wine wall, furniture I never would have chosen alone. Very little of me. I decided to convert the first floor into my office. Owen was the architect who specialized in historic properties. The first time he walked through the house, he spent about 20 minutes taking notes. Then he asked, "What do you want to keep?" I blinked. What? Most clients start by asking me what they should remove. He closed his notebook. I'd rather know what matters enough to you that we should build around it. I liked that question. I took him into the backyard. My mother had planted a pear tree there when she was young. It leaned badly to one side. The roots had started disturbing part of the stone wall. Adrian had spent years telling me we should cut it down. Owen studied it. We can keep it. Really? It'll cost more. I expected that, but yes, we can keep it. You're not going to tell me the design would look better without it? He shrugged. You're the one living here, not me. That was it. No dramatic moment, no music, no instant chemistry that changed my life. Just a man who understood that my home did not need to become his idea of what a home should be. We knew each other for 6 months before we ever went on a date. He never tried to turn our meetings into flirting. He never used my divorce as an opening. At the end of each design meeting, he asked some version of the same question. What do you want changed because you want it changed, not because Adrian wanted it, not because my mother wanted it, not because a designer thought it looked better, because I wanted it. One afternoon, we were eating sandwiches at the construction site. I asked, "Why have you never asked why I got divorced?" Owen looked down at his lunch. "Because if you want to tell me, you'll tell me." "You're not curious?" "Of course I'm curious." "Then why not ask?" He thought about it. Curiosity doesn't automatically give me the right to know. I did not say anything for a while. That evening, I was the one who asked him to get coffee. On our first real date, I told him exactly what my life looked like now. I own my house. I have my own accounts. I have my own business. And if I ever get serious with someone again, I'm not combining all of it. Owen nodded. Okay, I waited. That's it? Did you want me to argue? I laughed. My ex would have said that meant I didn't trust him. Owen thought for a moment. I don't think trust means handing someone every key you own. What does it mean? It means I know you have the keys and I don't make you prove anything by giving them to me. I sat in my car for a long time after that date. Not because he had said something incredibly romantic. Because I was starting to understand that a healthy relationship does not always make your heart race. Sometimes the first thing it gives you is safety. Owen and I moved slowly. Before he stayed at my house for the first time, he asked, "What time do you usually need quiet in the morning?" I laughed at how formal he sounded. But I liked it. When I said no, he did not go cold. If I had to cancel dinner because of a client emergency, he did not punish me with silence. He had his own work, his own friends, his own life. He did not need me to constantly prove that I loved him. About a year later, Adrian sent me an email. By then, he was out of management and had completed most of the legal process surrounding the investigation. The email was short. He wrote, "I used to think being needed meant being loved. Then I made sure you needed me so I would never have to wonder whether you loved me. By the time I understood the difference, I had already lost you." I read it twice. Then I closed it. I did not reply, not because I hated him, because there was nothing left for us to finish. A year and a half after I started dating Owen, he told me he wanted to marry me. We were standing under the pear tree in my backyard, but he did not kneel down. He did not suddenly open a ring box and demand an answer. He set a small box on the outdoor table. "This is not a question." I looked at him. "Then what is it?" "An option," I laughed. "What's the difference? A question can make you feel like you have to answer right now." He nodded toward the box. "An option can wait until you're ready." I opened it. The ring was simple. Exactly the kind of ring I would have chosen. I did not put it on. I asked, "What if I tell you I need more time?" "Then I take the ring home." "You won't be angry?" "I might be disappointed." He smiled a little. "But disappointment is my emotion. It isn't your responsibility." That made me cry. Not the ring. Not the proposal. That sentence. Because I finally understood something I had confused for love for a long time. I used to think that if someone was hurt by my refusal, it meant I should change my answer. Now I knew better. Mature love can include disappointment. What it cannot include is punishment for disappointing someone. I did not say yes that night. 3 days later, I went to Owen's place. I placed the ring box in front of him. "Now you can ask," he smiled. Then he really asked. I said yes. Our wedding had 32 guests. No reporters, no investors, no company announcements. My mother sat in the first row. Nina sat beside her. Rachel came too. During his vows, Owen did not say he would protect me from everything. He said, "I will not decide what is best for you without you. And when you want me standing beside you, I will be there." When it was my turn, I told him, I used to believe loving someone meant giving them everything I could. Now I know real love should allow both people to remain whole. Years later, someone asked me whether Adrian had ever truly loved me. I think he did, at least for part of our marriage. I do not need to rewrite the past as one long scam in order to accept how it ended. People change, relationships change, and the most dangerous moment is not always when someone stops loving you. It is when they start believing that because you love them, they have the right to use your money, your time, your career, your choices, your boundaries, even your name. That is no longer love. That is someone treating your trust as property. It took me 11 years to understand the difference, but I learned something else too. Choosing the wrong person once does not mean you chose the wrong life. I was 37 when I left my marriage. 38 when I rebuilt my career, 40 when I let myself fall in love again. I did not miss the best years of my life. I finally reached the years that actually belonged to me. For a long time, that forged signature felt like proof that my 11-year marriage had failed. Now I see it differently. It gave me a brutal but very clear answer. If someone needs you to become smaller so he can feel powerful, that is not a relationship you should keep fighting to save. Healthy love does not require you to surrender your judgment to prove trust. It does not require you to abandon your career to prove support. And it does not require you to lose yourself to prove you're willing to stay. Healthy love gives you choices. And it respects those choices, even when one of those choices is to leave. My happy ending was not Adrian losing his position as CEO. It was not Tessa leaving him. It was not the bank freezing the loan. It was not even marrying Owen. The day my life really changed was the day I looked at that forged signature and stopped asking, "Why is he doing this to me?" For the first time, I asked a different question: what do I need to do now to protect myself? That question changed everything. I took back my name, my career, my house, my judgment, my future, one piece at a time. And eventually I understood something I wish I had known much earlier. A woman does not truly begin again on the day someone comes to rescue her. She begins again on the day she finally believes her own life is worth protecting.